Welcome to Collegehood Advice. Today we're talking about how to grow your grit and hope with Dr. Sarah Porter.
So students with high levels of grit have higher GPAs, both a semester GPA and their overall college GPA, for example, despite lower SAT scores than their peers. And then interestingly, hope in particular is the number one predictor of college achievement.
Develop your superpowers and use your college experience to bring them to the world with Collegehood Advice, guidance and resources for students who want to thrive during college and beyond. I'm your host, college success strategist, Katy Oliveira. Real quick, are you subscribed to the show yet? If not, hit pause for a quick second and go into your podcast player app to subscribe or follow us wherever you're listening. Subscribing makes sure that you get the podcast as soon as they air, and it helps the podcast become more visible so that others can find the show. If you're already subscribed, you can also help others find the show by leaving a review in your favorite podcast player. Leaving reviews helps the podcast players know that this is high quality content, and it recommends it to other college students just like you who need help thriving and intentionally creating a life that they love during college. Thank you so much for subscribing and reviewing the show. It helps out a lot.
Hey guys, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today. I know that there are a lot of podcasts out there to listen to, and I'm always honored when you choose to spend your time hanging out with me. If you don't know me, I'm Katy. I'm the host here, and I help students just like you figure out who they are, what they want to do with their life, and how to use things like college or really any other kind of education to make it happen. I'm really glad you're here. Today on the show, we are talking to guest Dr. Sarah Porter about how to grow your grit and hope. I love this episode. I actually thought about airing this episode later this semester, closer to traditional time that we would have finals. But given the current climate, I decided to start this new fall season with this episode because what I realized is even though we talk all the time about the importance of academic skills and time management and picking a major that you love and going out in the world and exploring and all the other wonderful things that we talk about on the show, at the end of the day, grit and hope are absolutely essential to helping you be successful in whatever endeavors you pursue. And as you'll learn in this episode, some of us come by grit and hope pretty naturally, while other of us really need to work to cultivate it. And even if we don't come by it naturally, it is absolutely possible to grow these skills. You might remember Dr. Sarah Porter from our episode earlier in the year on how to cope during a crisis. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, I highly recommend it. Even if you are not currently coping with a personal crisis, but just helping you cope with the economic uncertainty and the sense of crisis and uncertainty that comes with COVID. It's super, super helpful. I found it really personally helpful, and I know that a lot of others did as well. I will link to it in the show notes, or you can head over to collegehoodadvice.com or your podcast app and look for How to Cope During a Crisis with Dr. Sarah Porter. It's awesome. One of the things that Dr. Porter shares during this episode that I think is really important to remember, and it's one of my favorite takeaways from the episode, is we all have the capacity to learn new ways of being or doing. And I think that that is incredibly important right now as things are shifting. Maybe our expectation of what this semester should look like isn't being met. Maybe we don't know what to expect still from the fall. There's a high level uncertainty. Will my college close? Will I be able to see my friends? Will I be able to go away to college? Is it okay that I hit pause this semester? Should I take a gap year? Is it worth it to pay for the semester? All these questions that I've heard percolating from the audience out there about how to face this semester. And I think that remembering that we have the capacity to shift and pivot to respond intentionally to whatever life brings us and to change our way of being and doing and still be true to ourselves, still use the experience of education to better ourselves is absolutely possible. So on the show, we're going to cover, of course, what grit and hope are and what makes some people grittier than others, as well as how grit helps you in life. And I'll tell you guys, this section of the episode just blew my mind. Just a little sneak peek. Gritty people have higher level productivity, higher level performance, more likely to get promoted. It's pretty remarkable. And also how we can build up our grit and hope if that doesn't come naturally to us, as well as how to connect with Dr. Porter and also her insights on how to navigate the current climate. Dr. Sarah Porter is a licensed psychologist who served on the counseling faculty of Austin Community College since 2011. She provides academic, career, and clinical counseling, as well as teaching student development courses there. And she loves helping individuals navigate the big questions of life, from figuring out the roadblocks of their academic success to pursuing a satisfying career. She has special interest in the fields of perfectionism, social anxiety, women's and LGBTQ plus issues, wellness programming, and training. She's recently developed a positive psychology-based toolkit to help students persist in school with a focus on self-compassion, grit and hope, gratitude, and self-care. I am thrilled to invite Dr. Porter back to the show, so let's give Dr. Porter a big welcome and dive into the episode. Sarah, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I'm so happy you're here today.
I'm so glad to be back. Thanks for having me again.
When you were here last, we talked about how to cope during a crisis. We talk broadly about coping with COVID, but most of the things all the things you said can be extended to any crisis that you might be experiencing. Today, we are going to talk about how to grow your grit and hope, which are really important skills with dealing with crisis, but then also everyday life. So I want to start by defining the word grit, because I think that that's a term that's kind of floated out there in the world online, especially, that not everyone may be completely certain about its meaning. And I want to set a meaning for our conversation. So what is grit?
Yeah, grit is a concept coined by a psychologist out of University of Pennsylvania named Dr. Angela Duckworth. And it's really quite simple. Grit is simply the passion for and perseverance toward long-term goals. And so we're not talking about conquering your to-do list or knocking out a really hard workout. We're talking about a focus on achieving a long-term, higher level goal, what Duckworth talks about as living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's important to have both that passion and that perseverance. Because if you think about it, if you only have passion, that can be a pipe dream, right? That you never get to realize. And then if you only have perseverance, it can feel like drudgery. So you need to have both of those ingredients and then a stick-to-itiveness toward a long-term goal.
Oh my gosh, I love that so often, because especially in my field where we're helping students identify what they want to do with their life and how to leverage experiences and education to collect the things that they need to actually achieve their goals, we focused often on your passions and your purpose and talk less about the perseverance and stick-to-itiveness and resiliency that it takes to weather setbacks, challenges, acquisition of skills, frustration, all of the things that go along with working towards your goal. And so that's such a beautiful and simple way of explaining it.
I'm nodding my head.
Yeah. So if you're out there and you're thinking about, why can't I find my purpose? Why can't I achieve my passion? And, you're kind of knocking your head against the wall. I think that this is a really important distinction of thinking about the other side of the coin might be missing in some of those conversations, some of that thinking and some of that effort. So I hope that that's helpful. So what makes some people grittier than others? Because in my observation, there are those people who intuitively know that they have to persevere to reach their passion, and those people who sort of fold very easily.
Mm-hmm. There is some research that suggests that some people do have a genetic predisposition toward grit. So maybe they're just wired toward that passion and perseverance. But it's important to remember that even if we don't, we all have the capacity to learn new ways of being and doing, which in the kind of biopsychology world we call neuroplasticity. So you can cultivate or grow your grit even if it doesn't come naturally. And it turns out that gritty people tend to have kind of 4 traits or behaviors, and these are all things we can develop if they didn't come to us naturally or organically. The first is interest. So gritty people have a really well-defined interest. And I think so often we talk about finding your passion as if you're just going to be walking along and it's going to pop up. But gritty people focus on developing their passion. So it comes with some hard work to get there. And you know, Duckworth, she says that it's really not a mental exercise, it's an experiential one. So you develop your passion by doing some of the things you mentioned, like job shadowing or volunteering or doing occupational research. And then also people who are gritty tend to be what we call intrinsically motivated. So that motivation that comes from within you. And so if you're wondering, well, what is my intrinsic motivation? You might think about, what are the things I do where I lose track of time? That can be really enlightening about where a passion might lie. Or what's on that super secret bucket list that I feel too shy to share with others? And think about that, because those might be some of those motivations from deep within that could guide your passion. And then, of course, it's about identifying and building upon your strengths. So gritty people know what their strengths are and then figure out ways to apply those. And, you know, I'm fortunate to work with students, and often we actually do a strength survey. And there's a really good one online by VIA that I can share the link with you on if people are wondering, what are my strengths? Because that can help you develop that interest. And then another kind of trait of a gritty person is they practice a lot. And when we say that, we mean it in a really particular way. So you may have heard that 10,000 hour rule, that it takes 10,000 hours over 10 years to become an expert. While it's true that you need to engage in a high quantity of practice, you also need to engage in quality practice, which is something called deliberate practice. And so that's a very particular way in which you do it. You don't just, let's say you're mastering the clarinet. You don't just play the scales over and over for 10,000 hours. You need to be really specific about improving a targeted behavior. And so you want to challenge yourself, meaning that you need to figure out a skill just beyond your current level and expect that you're going to feel some frustration as you practice. That's a sign that you're practicing and growing your grit. And then also you need to use the feedback of others. So people who are already more expert in whatever endeavor you're pursuing, turn to them, get their feedback, use that feedback, work on your weaknesses, and keep pushing. And then also what can help with that practice is remembering that you have a growth mindset, which is a term that I think a lot of people know. It's commonly discussed now, and it's particularly in our K through 12 education, which is about the fact that our ability is malleable. It's not fixed. So we can grow and develop ourselves. So when you are practicing and it is hard, you can say something to yourself like, yeah, this is really hard, but it doesn't mean I can't do it. I just haven't mastered it yet. And I think too, when people are practicing, they need to be comfortable with failure. And so gritty people know that failure is a really essential part of their learning. You may hear sometimes in the tech sector or the business world, failing forward, which is that idea that innovation only comes when you take risks, and you'll likely fall on your face. And the important thing is to get back up, take stock of what worked and what didn't, regroup and apply that learning to try to perfect your skill, meet your goal, solve that problem. So that's the second thing that people who are gritty have in them. And then the third is actually what you mentioned, Katy, it's purpose. So it's not enough to just figure out an interest and log a lot of hours practicing. You need to have an ultimate why that extends to something or makes connections to something outside of you. So that could be a connection to your faith tradition. That could be a connection to your community, that could be connection to your family. And so a question to ask yourself, and what a lot of gritty people can answer very easily, is how can I do the most good for other people in this thing I have chosen? So that's another way to kind of figure out your purpose, and also do a gut check. So is what I'm working toward aligned with my values? So let's say your values, your kind of core values are community and health and security. You may go, okay, I think I want to become a nurse and that's a long-term goal. Does that fit with my values? And I would argue in this case, yes. And certainly doing community service, if you're uncertain, can help you figure out where your purpose might lie. And then the last component of gritty people is they have hope. And they have hope in a way that means something slightly different than how we use that word in our day-to-day. So we often talk about hope interchangeably with optimism, but there was a kind of foremost hope scholar, yes, there is such a thing, named Dr. Shane Lopez, who clarified that hope is where action meets belief. So it's action plus belief. So it's not just the wishful thinking that can come with optimism, but it's also the taking action toward it. And one of Lopez's predecessors, Charles Schneider, identified 3 different ingredients to building your hope. You need to have goals, which we, all know that intuitively. So your vision for your future. You need to have pathways. So these are the routes to get there and the specific strategies we're going to use to achieve those goals. And then you need to have agency, which is that belief in yourself, the belief that I can make this happen. And it turns out that generally speaking, all of us, gritty or not, are pretty good at believing in ourselves and decent at setting goals. But only about half of us have hope because we often struggle to come up with those pathways. And it's important to come up with more than one pathway. You want to have a plan A, plan B, plan C. So those are kind of the ingredients or traits that gritty people tend to have. What I would say is there's an important caveat to all of this. Concepts like grit and growth mindset and hope are incredibly powerful, but we're not gritty in a vacuum. So I think it's also important to acknowledge the environment in which we live and learn. It's a heck of a lot easier to exhibit growth mindset and in turn grit when you're given the resources and the opportunities and the space to take risks and develop yourself. Whereas you may be more likely to default to a fixed mindset if you're disproportionately punished for your mistakes, or you might be less gritty when you're told implicitly or explicitly that your long-term goals aren't achievable, which is often the experience of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color students. So I was talking about this with a friend recently, and she shared this bug in the wind metaphor, which just made sense to me. As she said, it's easy for the bug to fly when the air is calm, but it's significantly more difficult for the bug to fly when the wind kicks up. And so you can think about racism and sexism and ableism and many of the other isms as the wind that can make it significantly harder for some folks to quote unquote fly or grow their grit and hope. So I feel like it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that when we're talking about why some people might be grittier than others. And I would say if this resonates to you or your listeners, this could be a goal, right? This could be one of those long-term goals that people might set for themselves to help really explore and dismantle the systems of oppression that put the onus of responsibility on the individual student to quote unquote dig deep or just apply themselves or pull themselves up from their bootstraps.
Oh, there's so much there that's incredibly important and makes so much sense. And I think that sometimes too, to know that there is a system at work and not just an individual experience is really important too when thinking about these things. I find my background is a history and teaching a history course and a social issues course. And the very first thing we do on the very first day is talk about the difference between individual problems versus social problems. Mm-hmm. And many people can't see social problems, they interpret them to be their own individual doing or their own individual issues. They don't realize that what's happening to them may be emerging from a more systemic issue, and how they're responding and living that is personal and individual, but there are bigger systems at play. And I think Grit and Hope, this conversation really points to that there are bigger systems at play sometimes in our own experience of perseverance.
Yes. And so you can learn lots of strategies and you can use skills to cultivate your grit and to kind of elicit your hope. It's important to also recognize that we need to look at the systems and work actively to advocate for people who are treated differently within those systems, right? And try to really clean up the systems that are filled with oppression of various types, right? So it's important to balance both. So we want to teach the skills, and I think Grit and Hope are helpful regardless of the backdrop. I just think it's important to also recognize that it's easier for some people to harness that grit. So when you ask, are some people grittier than others? The answer is yes, with an asterisk next to it that says, look at the systems at play.
And so that being said, why is grit an important thing to have in life?
I think a lot of people, if they're familiar with Dr. Duckworth, they know that grit has huge benefits in our academics. So students with high levels of grit have higher GPAs, both a semester GPA and their overall college GPA, for example, despite lower SAT scores than their peers. And then interestingly, hope in particular is the #1 predictor of college achievement, regardless of your previous academic skills or achievement, your intelligence, or your personality. And it turns out that students who are high in hope are 12% more productive than their peers and earn a full letter grade higher in a given course. So academically, it's significant. You're also more likely to graduate from college if you're high in hope and grit. There's also applications within our career. So this is kind of amazing, but high hope workers get more done in a week, a full day's worth, than their lower hope colleagues. So high hope people can work a 4-day work week and knock out the same workload as their lower hope peers who work Monday through Friday. And also, high hope employees tend to get higher performance evaluations and are more satisfied in their jobs. And if you ever want to be a manager, it's really important to embody grit and hope, because there was a Gallup poll that showed that what people most seek in their leaders, whether those are their bosses or their pastors or even political figures, is they want people who embody hope. So it's got real benefits in your career. And then it also has some benefits to just your mental health and well-being. You're less likely to experience anxiety and depression. And when you do, you tend to recover more readily. And then people who are high in hope in particular have a 10% bump in their happiness scores over other people. So grit and hope are pretty important across multiple parts of our lives.
We'll get back to the episode in just a moment. Collegehood Advice is brought to you by our Best Semester Ever Challenge. Are you ready to make the most of this semester no matter what it looks like or where you are? Join me for the Best Semester Ever Challenge, where we'll spend 5 days working on getting you organized, motivated, and ready for whatever this semester may bring. When you join, you'll get access to a daily live mini lesson with me. And of course, if you can't make it live, you can catch it in the replay. You'll also get access to simple action steps to help you implement what you're learning, our challenge community to support you along the way, and unlimited text and voice message advice from me all week long, all for completely free. Sign up at collegehoodadvice.com/challenge or click the link in the show notes right there in your podcast player and bring your friends. The challenge begins on Monday, August 24th. Can't wait to see you there.
I'd say so. That's amazing. Yeah. The amount of impact on performance, productivity, moving forward in your career, achievement in your career, that's remarkable.
Yeah. The productivity one kills me. I'm like, wow, it makes that big a difference, but it's so true. So yeah, it's very impactful, which is why we do want to try to build our grit and hope wherever we can.
It's remarkable because we spend so much time on skills building, that's, time management, study strategies, these sorts of things, and academic circles. And hope seems to be key to being able to move these things forward, which is part of why I spend so much time here at Collegehood on mindset and the whole person, because I've seen over and over again in my practice, working with students over the years, it can teach students tons of college success strategies, but if there's not hope, if there's not growth mindset, then they're not going to use them. Often students have the skill sets, but they don't have those underlying things like grit and hope to help them utilize them and take advantage of the skill sets that they have.
Right. It's almost like we're teaching it in the wrong order, because you want to have some really clear long-term goals ahead of time. Otherwise, you can learn every skill possible for studying effectively, test taking, managing your time. But if you don't have a why or a where that you're headed, you don't know when to use them or why you're using them, right? So it's almost like we need to clarify up front what somebody's long-term goal is and cultivate those pathways and that agency before you teach all the skills that will kind of help you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, how do we build our grit and hope then?
Well, there's a couple of ways. I've mentioned a few when I was talking about those kind of 4 traits that people who are gritty tend to have. But certainly, there's a couple of exercises that I really like. One of them is called the best possible self exercise. And this can be done by yourself or in a group. It can be visual, but I prefer it as a written exercise. And this is where you envision a future in which everything is turned out as well as you could imagine, thanks to your efforts. And when I talk about the future, I'm talking pretty far out. There's a researcher out of North Carolina, Brian Sexton, who I just listened to a talk of his. And he said he's doing a study right now that shows that people have an easier time imagining the goodness in their life further out into the future versus the near future. So the way you can do this best possible self-exercise is you can briefly journal every day for about 2 weeks and start out with envisioning this future where everything turned out exactly as you wanted 15 years out. And maybe write about that a couple days. And then bring the time horizon in a little bit to maybe 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, and then 6 months. So basically over that 2-week period, you're building out a really detailed vision, starting from the furthest into the future time point and bringing it closer. So that can be really helpful in building out our grit and hope. Also staying mindful of grass is always greener thinking. It turns out that people who are high in grit tend to look at the world and stay focused on the world right in front of them, rather than doing that comparison to others or to what could be better on the other side. And I always argue that the grass is greener where you water it. So if you catch yourself looking in wistfully at someone else's choices, just say, hey, hold on, let me stay in my own lane and just focus on putting the effort in and watering my grass. It can also be helpful to remember your successes and achievements that you've had in the past and figure out, well, what did I do to get there? That can be really helpful. And then there's this really cool study, I think it was actually someone's dissertation back in 2015, that showed that community college students on academic probation, so students who are academically in some trouble, if they mentored other students on grit, so coach them on not giving up despite a bad grade and studying really hard and identifying and keeping their why or their goal in mind, as mentors, they actually had their own grit, their own goal setting, and their own academic preparedness increase. So one way you can build up your grit and hope is serving as a kind of grit mentor to others. And you can also draw upon surrogate grit, which is a term Duckworth uses. So basically surround yourself with gritty people and surround yourself with hopeful people, because hope is contagious. Dr. Lopez said that hope is contagious to the 3rd degree, which means that if you feel hopeful, you can pass it on to your partner and their friend. So being around hopeful, gritty people will actually help build up your grit and hope. And then probably the other exercise, one of my go-tos that I was thinking would be great, Katy, when you mentioned, we teach all these study strategies, but if we haven't figured out grit and hope yet, it's hard to figure out how to apply them. I would say maybe start conversations with doing a hope map. And a hope map is really simple. There's instructions online that I can share with you, but it's taking an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and breaking it into columns. And you simply start with one column that's entitled goals, and you write down one of your most important goals in order to become that best possible future self. And then you backtrack and you go to the pathways and you brainstorm at least 3 different pathways, because we know the more pathways we have, the more likely we'll get there. And then you go to a third column, which is your obstacles, and you identify what's at least one obstacle for each of these pathways. So maybe it's, I want to go back to school I want to become a lawyer. And so then the pathway is I need to complete my bachelor's degree, study for the LSAT. And then you go, okay, what are the obstacles? Well, I'm a mother of 2 kids and I don't have childcare. Or, I'm working while going to school full time, so I have really limited time. Or I don't know that I have enough money for an LSAT prep course. So you figure out what those obstacles are, and then you go back to your pathway column and you add some other strategies. So maybe it would be something like, I'm going to apply for a scholarship that I just heard about to help with the money. Or I'm going to see if I can exchange childcare babysitting with my neighbor, something like that. So you really want to go back and refine your pathways to address some of the obstacles that could come up. And then what I love about this too is you have almost like your cheerleaders around the perimeter of your page. So that's where you figure out what's going to keep you motivated, because we know that this focus on long-term goals requires a lot of continual effort, even when it feels tough. So you figure out, who are my supporters? Who are the people who are going to be there cheering me along? And what are the mile markers along the way that I can kind of celebrate? And how will I celebrate those things? So I find creating a hope map is one of the best ways to start growing your grit and growing your hope.
And the thing I'd like to point out about every single one of these strategies is it's really about getting out there and taking really simple action,
yes.
Getting out of your head and being okay with sort of mapping it out and playing and trying things on and adapting. And the stakes are really low. It's really about getting out there and doing it. And when you face an obstacle, come up with a creative solution, engage in some creative problem solving, use support, which are all essential to success.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are all really, most of them are free, right? These are free, require no supplies. I mean, it's really just, you have paper and a pen, you can do a lot of this work yourself. So yeah, that's what I love about it. And these are very growable, developable skills. I see it all the time. I teach, and I teach college students, and I see it all the time with my students starting the semester, because I work with students in their first semester typically, coming in and feeling a bit aimless. They know they need to go to college because that's what everyone tells them to do, but they're not sure why. And as a result, they have a hard time feeling really motivated and keeping that motivation going. And as we start to figure out and refine the goals and the reason why, the purpose, and then teach them ways to practice that are actually impactful. I mean, it's contagious and it's self-perpetuating. You see a shift happen in students, and they come out feeling really excited about their future and willing to put in all the work they need to get there.
Yeah, because it's moving motivation issues away from a personal issue, like a personal flaw, to, of course, you're not motivated. You aren't sure, you haven't fleshed out your why, and you're not sure what you're working towards. And so of course you're not motivated, because it's not clear to you why you would put forth all this effort. And college is hard. It requires a lot of effort. And if you don't have a clear why, it can be really challenging to become motivated to put forth that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we don't necessarily tell people, right? We just assume you know this, but why? Nobody really is born knowing how to grow their grit or how to build hope in the way that we talk about it in the psychological world. And these are very teachable things that are kind of mysterious until you tell them. And then it's like, oh, wow, okay, that's totally doable. You can demystify something that can feel so out of reach otherwise.
Absolutely. Well, we have covered so much ground and you have shared so many amazing strategies and things to think about. How can listeners connect with you if they have questions?
Yeah, probably your best bet is to visit my website, which is just www.drsarahporter.com, or you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to field questions about this and more.
And is there anything else we should know before we sign off today?
You know, probably the only, as we're talking, it made me think about this, probably the only other piece is something called regoaling, which Lopez says is where hope meets courage. And this means that sometimes we have a really clear goal in mind. We have a lot of grit, but we experience a major setback. So maybe you receive a significant medical diagnosis, or maybe a dismissal from an academic program that requires us to go back to the drawing board and generate a new goal. Or more often what happens is we find ourselves hitting roadblock after roadblock. And because we're gritty, we're reluctant to let go and reset our goals. And so if you think you're reaching that point, that's when you want to meet with your, what I call brain trust, which is a Brene Brown term, but your trusted people, the people who are reliable and have your best interests in mind. So this might be your therapist, a career counselor, your faculty mentor, and really bounce the ideas off of them to help sort out whether to keep persisting or whether it makes sense to re-goal. So kind of reset and apply your grit to a new goal. You don't have to do this very often, but I always like to mention it because otherwise there are some cases where you feel like you're just banging your head against the wall. And that's where you want to call in your brain trust and decide whether it makes sense to re-goal or simply kind of refine the strategies and pathways that you've already identified.
I'm so glad you said that because re-goaling is so important. And I think sometimes people who are gritty or practicing grit or trying to grow their grit are hesitant to do that because they feel like it's quitting.
Right. And it's not. It's simply, I mean, it's smart, it's effective ultimately, and it's honoring the realities of your life. And you can use that same grit and hope applying to a new goal, right?
Absolutely. And then sometimes opportunities or unexpected pathways opened up that you can't plan for. And so if you have your blinders on, you keep going and you might miss something that was really amazing and not something you necessarily anticipated.
Right. You don't want to be too rigid. So I think the flip side, you know, of having, I don't know if there's such thing as having too much grit, but I think coming alongside a lot of grit is sometimes a hyper focus or a rigidity that you're right. Maybe you're missing out on an opportunity or a subtle shift that could open up and unlock even more exciting doors, more exciting opportunities that align with your values and your why and your strengths. So yeah, it's definitely worth having that re-goaling in your back pocket just in case.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm so happy that you came back to talk about this really important topic.
Thank you for having me, Katy. It was a pleasure.
If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Sarah, and we'd love to hear what resonated with you from the show. If there are specific tips that you found helpful or things that you're going to implement into your life, if you would like to share those with us, I'd love to hear it. Visit me over at Collegehood Advice on Instagram. Send me a DM and let me know what you're thinking, or you can head over to collegehoodadvice.com and leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you're thinking after this episode.
Thank you for listening. Head over to Collegehood Advice for show notes, links, and resources we mentioned in this episode. And while you're there, sign up for weekly updates and get access to our library full of free tools to help you college. And if you love the show, consider sharing it with a friend or leaving a review on your favorite podcast player. It really helps us grow the show. Remember, your purpose is to be you, and your goal during college is to grow and develop your superpowers so you can thrive.